It was a bright and warm morning when a man decided to set out from Jerusalem to Jericho. The road was long and dangerous, known for its sharp turns and deep ravines. Merchants and travelers passing through were aware of the risks, but the man felt he needed to continue his journey. Perhaps he was returning home, or maybe he was seeking new opportunities. Either way, his thoughts drifted in the desert heat as his steady steps advanced across the arid and treacherous terrain. What he didn't know, however, was that lurking along this same road were treacherous men, bandits waiting to ambush and rob lonely travelers. This was a common practice at the time, and many avoided traveling alone on such perilous routes. But the man was alone, vulnerable, and before he could even realize it, he was attacked. Suddenly, a group of thieves jumped out from behind the rocks. Without any warning, they violently assaulted him. Blows rained down on him until he was left on the brink of unconsciousness. The bandits took everything he had: his clothes, his coins, his most valuable possessions. Then, without any mercy, they left him there, beaten, wounded, and powerless under the desert's relentless sun. Silence returned to the road, but now it was a heavy silence, marked by the weak groans of the man struggling to breathe. Hours passed, and the injured man could barely open his eyes. His thoughts were clouded by pain, and the day's heat only made his situation seem even more desperate. He knew that if no one found him soon, his life might slip away right there on that desolate road. It was then that he heard footsteps in the distance. His half-closed eyes could barely make out the figure approaching, but he felt a flicker of hope. Someone was coming. Perhaps this was his salvation. It was a priest, someone who, by his position, should be an example of mercy and compassion. The priest, however, upon approaching and seeing the man lying there, hesitated. He looked at the injured man, observed the blood staining his clothes, and his thoughts began to race. Jewish law was clear. Touching a body that seemed close to death would render the priest unclean. This would mean he couldn't fulfill his duties at the temple and would have to go through a long purification process. With a divided heart, the priest made a decision. He veered off the path, crossing to the other side of the road. Without saying a word, he continued his journey, leaving the wounded man behind, left to his own fate. Once again, silence fell over the road. The hope the injured man had felt quickly vanished, and he returned to face the lonely void of his pain. Time continued to pass, and the sun was now high in the sky when another traveler appeared on the road. This time it was a Levite, an assistant to the priests, someone also well-versed in the laws of God, and who, in theory, should follow the example of love and compassion. The Levite saw the fallen man, realized the gravity of his situation, but, like the priest, he hesitated. His eyes filled with concern, but he knew that touching this man, possibly dead or dying, would also put him in a complicated position under the law. Without much thought, the Levite also changed his course. Like the priest, he avoided the injured man and moved on. His heart may have been troubled, but he didn't look back. For him, his obligations and ceremonial purity came first. Now, the man was completely abandoned. Two figures who should have been his hope for salvation had passed by, but neither was able to extend a hand. His breathing was shallow, and his half-open eyes could barely focus on the horizon. His mind wondered how much longer he could hold on. Perhaps this was the end, he thought. In the dusty horizon, a shadow began to move slowly. The injured man, his vision blurred by pain, could hardly tell if it was real or just his imagination. His heart beat faster, torn between hope and fear. Would this be another person who passed by without a glance? As the figure approached, something about them made him tremble. It wasn't a priest or a Levite. It was a Samaritan. The man's already fragile heart nearly gave up for good. A Samaritan? Of all people? Someone his people considered an enemy. Could it be that his salvation would come from where he least expected it? The Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. There was a deep historical rivalry between them, and it was unthinkable that a Samaritan would stop to help a Jew on the road. Both peoples despised each other due to religious and cultural differences, and the enmity was so profound that an ordinary Jew would rather avoid any contact with a Samaritan. But to the fallen man's surprise, the Samaritan stopped. He dismounted his donkey and approached slowly. Unlike the other travelers, his eyes didn't show fear or hesitation. Instead, there was compassion in his expression. The Samaritan looked at the wounded man and saw the suffering he was enduring. Without a second thought, the Samaritan knelt beside him. With careful hands, he began to treat the man's wounds, using oil and wine to clean and disinfect them, items he had brought along for his own journey. The Samaritan didn't care about the man's ethnicity or religion. What mattered to him was the evident suffering and the need for help. After tending to the wounds, the Samaritan helped the man to his feet. He placed him on his own donkey, making sure the injured man was as comfortable as possible. Together, they began the journey to a nearby inn, where the Samaritan knew the man could receive proper care. When they arrived at the inn, the Samaritan not only paid for the man's stay, but he also gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins, a considerable amount at the time. He instructed the innkeeper to take care of the man and promised that upon his return from his trip, he would cover any additional costs needed to ensure the man's full recovery. The Samaritan wasn't seeking recognition or reward for his actions. He simply acted out of a sense of compassion and responsibility toward his fellow human being, something that the other travelers, the priest and the Levite, had ignored. When Jesus finished telling this parable, he looked at the law expert who had asked the question, "Who is my neighbor?" The expert, perhaps surprised by the choice of a Samaritan as the hero of the story, had to acknowledge the truth. He replied to Jesus, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus then looked at him and said, "Go and do likewise." As the Samaritan continued on his way, the injured man, now safe in the inn, began to regain consciousness. Though still weak and unable to move much, he could feel that something had changed. The pain in his body, though intense, felt less overwhelming. He could smell the faint scent of oil on his wounds and realized that he was lying in a comfortable bed, far from the dust and the scorching heat of the road. For a moment, he tried to remember what had happened. Slowly, flashes of the events returned to his mind. The brutal attack, the thieves taking everything, and then silence. His mind wandered, trying to piece together who had saved him. Was it the priest? Maybe the Levite? Those religious men who had passed by? But as his memory cleared, he realized that the answer was neither. The person who had stopped to help him, who had treated his wounds and carried him to safety, was someone he would have never expected, a Samaritan. A wave of disbelief washed over him. He, a Jew, had been saved by someone his people considered an enemy. Samaritans were viewed with disdain, as impure outsiders. Yet, it was a Samaritan who had shown him the kind of compassion that his own religious leaders had failed to offer. The irony wasn't lost on the injured man, and he felt both grateful and confused. How could it be that help had come from the very place he least expected? As he rested, his emotions oscillated between gratitude and deep reflection. That act of unexpected kindness began to stir something deeper within him. He had always believed he knew the boundaries of love for one's neighbor. That compassion was something reserved only for those of his own nation and faith. But what he had just experienced challenged that belief. Meanwhile, at the small inn, the Samaritan was preparing to continue his journey. He had done all he could for the injured man. He knew that recovery would take time, which was why he had left 2 silver coins with the innkeeper, a sum that would ensure proper care for his new friend. Before departing, the Samaritan approached the innkeeper. With a sincere look, he said, "Take good care of him. If there are any additional expenses, I'll pay them when I return." With that, the Samaritan continued on his way, leaving behind a profound lesson of compassion that transcended all boundaries, ethnic, religious, or cultural. The man lying in the inn was no longer just a wounded traveler, but someone transformed by the realization that kindness knows no limits. The innkeeper, impressed by the Samaritan's generosity, nodded in agreement. It was rare to see someone care so much for a stranger, especially someone from a different people. The Samaritan, through his actions, displayed a humanity that transcended any cultural or religious barrier. With his mission complete, the Samaritan mounted his donkey once more and departed. There were no applause or recognition for his kindness. No one followed to offer thanks, but he didn't need any of that. For him, the simple act of helping someone in need was its own reward. The Samaritan continued on his way, now alone on the road that had so often witnessed the worst of humanity. With each step of his donkey, he reflected on the reality of this journey. He knew that in other circumstances he could just as easily have been the one lying on the roadside. Life was unpredictable, and the fate of all travelers, including his own, was uncertain. The distant mountains, with their sharp rocks and threatening shadows, stood as silent witnesses to countless stories of suffering and abandonment that the road held. How many others had been left there, with no one stopping to help? How many times had people looked the other way, hurriedly passing by to avoid the inconvenience of getting involved? The Samaritan's journey continued, but in his heart, he felt that something profound had changed. He hadn't just helped an injured man. He had broken an invisible barrier that separated two peoples, two worlds that rarely touched. And in that moment, he realized that the true path to God didn't pass through rituals or traditions, but through the love and compassion shown to others. The story of the Good Samaritan wasn't just about kindness. It was about choices. Everyone who passed by the injured man had the opportunity to choose. The priest and the Levite, people of high status within Jewish society, made a choice that reflected more about them than about their religious duties. They chose to protect themselves, their reputation, their ceremonial purity, rather than demonstrate love for their neighbor. The Samaritan's choice, on the other hand, was radical. He knew that stopping to help would put his own safety at risk. He knew that touching an injured man, especially a Jew, could invite disapproval from his fellow Samaritans. Yet he chose to help. He chose compassion over fear, love over prejudice. True acts of compassion are not done out of convenience or obligation, but from recognizing the dignity of a human being in their most vulnerable state. The Samaritan didn't know this man, had no obligation to help him, but in his choice, he showed that true mercy transcends cultural and religious barriers. This lesson, however, didn't end there. Jesus' telling of the Good Samaritan wasn't just to entertain or inspire. It was a direct response to a fundamental question. Who is my neighbor? The law expert who had asked Jesus this question was likely expecting a straightforward, comfortable answer, one that reaffirmed his beliefs about who deserved to be loved and who could be ignored. But Jesus' response, delivered through this parable, challenged any preconceived notions. He chose the most unlikely character to be the hero of the story. A Samaritan, a natural enemy of the Jews, was the one who demonstrated the true meaning of loving one's neighbor. In doing so, Jesus not only challenged the beliefs of the law expert, but also the expectations of all those listening. At the end of the story, when Jesus asked the law expert who had been the true neighbor to the injured man, the answer came reluctantly, but clearly, the one who had mercy on him. The law expert was forced to acknowledge that compassion knows no boundaries, and that one's neighbor is not defined by ethnic, religious, or cultural ties, but by acts of mercy and kindness. The parable of the Good Samaritan goes beyond a simple story of kindness. It is an invitation that transcends time, calling us to look at others with fresh eyes. It's not just about who we help, but about how we see the value of every human life, regardless of who they are. Jesus teaches us that the true neighbor is the one in need, and true faith is shown in actions, not merely words. For many, the neighbor is someone who lives next to us, who shares our culture, religion, and beliefs. However, Jesus shows us that our true neighbor can be anyone, especially those who are marginalized, suffering, and in need of our help. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho is more than a physical place. It represents the path of life, with all its difficulties and challenges. At some point, each of us will face decisions about how to respond to the suffering and need of others. Like the priest and the Levite, we can choose to cross to the other side, avoiding the inconvenience of involvement. Or, like the Samaritan, we can choose to stop, help, and show that true love knows no boundaries. As the Samaritan continued on his way, the desert heat made the air nearly unbreathable. The dry wind constantly whipped up clouds of dust, and the distant mountains appeared blurred by the heat. The donkey he rode was visibly tired, but continued to walk steadily along the road. The Samaritan, however, felt in his heart the lightness that comes from inner peace, the kind that only doing good can bring. As the miles accumulated and the barren landscapes passed by, his thoughts wandered back to the man he had found lying on the road. How many others had passed that man without offering help? And how many more would have done the same if he, too, had ignored the suffering of that stranger? It was a hard and bitter truth the Samaritan faced. The world was full of indifference. He knew that the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a place of many sufferings and dangers. Violence was common in that region, and the bandits lurking to ambush lone travelers had no compassion for anyone. Even worse, many of those who walked these same roads turned a blind eye to the suffering of others, whether out of fear, convenience, or simple disinterest. The Samaritan vividly recalled the expression on the injured man's face when he found him. There was not only physical pain, but also a look of despair, as if he had lost all hope of being saved. Perhaps this despair was fueled by the memory that others had passed by before the Samaritan, the priest and the Levite. The Samaritan knew that the priest, in his elevated position, and the Levite, an assistant at the temple, were both men who should have acted differently. But what had happened within them? What made them choose to ignore the suffering? Was it fear of breaking religious rules, or a greater concern for their own ceremonial purity? The Samaritan wondered if, deep down, the priest and the Levite had simply become accustomed to bypassing other people's problems. Life often places difficult choices before each person. It's not always easy to stop and help, especially when there's so much at stake: safety, status, religious, or social obligations. But for the Samaritan, the choice to help wasn't just an option. It was a moral obligation. He knew that the true value of his faith and his humanity was measured not by words or appearances, but by actions. The priest and the Levite, in their sacred and respectable garments, had a greater responsibility. But, ironically, they were the ones who chose to ignore the call to love their neighbor. By leaving that man on the brink of death, they lost the chance to fulfill one of the most essential commandments: to love your neighbor as yourself. As the Samaritan reflected on these things, his mind turned to a childhood memory. He remembered being just a boy, playing in the streets of his Samaritan village. At that time, he didn't understand the divisions that existed between Jews and Samaritans. To him, they were just stories the adults told, tales of a distant past. He recalled one time when, as a boy, his mother had taken him to a Jewish market. The tension between the two peoples was always present, but that day, something unexpected happened. While at the market, his mother suddenly fainted from the extreme heat. The people around, mostly Jews, hesitated to help. Many simply stepped back, murmuring about impure Samaritans. But amidst the crowd, a Jewish man approached, ignoring the disapproving glances of the others. He lifted the boy's mother into his arms and carried her to a shaded area where she could recover. The young Samaritan never forgot that act of kindness. That memory, buried deep in his heart, had stayed with him throughout his life. It reminded him that compassion could bridge the widest divides. Now, as an adult, he realized that the divisions between peoples were not as strong as the power of mercy. The Samaritan had chosen not just to help a man in need, but to break the chains of prejudice that had shackled his people for generations. As the Samaritan rode on, The landscape around him remained harsh and unforgiving, but within him, a new understanding had taken root. The true measure of a person was not in the rituals they followed or the labels placed upon them by society, but in the simple, courageous act of loving another human being, no matter who they were. And so, the Samaritan continued down the road, alone but filled with a profound sense of purpose. His actions had spoken louder than any prayer, ritual, or sacrifice ever could. He had answered the call of love, and in doing so, had left a lasting legacy, a story that would be told for centuries, challenging everyone who heard it to reconsider what it truly means to be a neighbor. Now, many years later, the Samaritan found himself reflecting on that moment. The Jewish man who had helped his mother did not care about the social or religious barriers that separated them. He had seen a person in need and, without hesitation, extended a helping hand. That act of compassion had left an indelible mark on the Samaritan's heart, and perhaps it was this memory that had inspired him, so many years later, to act in a similar way. The Samaritan then recalled a lesson he had learned early in life. True mercy does not choose faces, nor ask where someone comes from or where they are going. Mercy, he knew, was the purest reflection of the divine character. And at that moment, he understood that what he had done for the man fallen on the road was just a small repayment for all the times God had been merciful to him. The Samaritan's journey continued, but with each step, he realized there was more to learn. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a metaphor for the journey of life. At many points, we find ourselves like the fallen man, wounded by hardships, betrayals, and the exhaustion of daily struggles. At other times, we are like those who pass by, pretending not to see the suffering, whether out of fear or indifference. But occasionally, we have the opportunity to be like the Samaritan, to choose to act with compassion, to become agents of healing and kindness in the world. And that choice, he knew, was not always easy. Sometimes we help others without expecting anything in return, and that requires courage and sacrifice. The Samaritan understood that the true call of his faith was to demonstrate God's love through his actions. It didn't matter whom he helped, whether Jew, Samaritan, or foreigner. What mattered was that he had responded to the call of his conscience, his heart, and something greater than himself. As the Samaritan disappeared over the horizon, the wounded man in the inn began to recover. The simple food and rest were helping his body heal, but something deeper was also changing within him. He reflected on what had happened, on the stranger who had become his savior. The injured Jew had never imagined that a Samaritan could be the answer to his prayers in that moment of despair. He had grown up hearing stories about the rivalries between their peoples, about how Samaritans were impure and unworthy. But now, in that humble bed, he began to question all those beliefs. How could he despise a people whose member had been more merciful to him than anyone else? The Samaritan's kindness transcended all prejudices and divisions. And now, the fallen man realized that a true neighbor was not defined by ethnicity or religion, but by the ability to show love and mercy in times of need. Time passed, and the story of the Samaritan was told and retold many times. The Jewish people who heard Jesus tell this parable were likely surprised by the choice of characters. At that time, the separation between Jews and Samaritans was deep, and many Jews would have been offended to hear that the hero of the story was someone they despised. But this was precisely Jesus' intention. By choosing the Samaritan as the example of compassion, Jesus sought to tear down the barriers that people had built between themselves. He wanted his followers to understand that true love for one's neighbor wasn't about following rules or maintaining an appearance of purity. True love for one's neighbor was practical, active, and involved seeing the suffering of another human being and reaching out, regardless of who they were. At the end of the parable, Jesus looked at the law expert who had asked him, "Who is my neighbor?" Now that man knew the answer. It wasn't a question of who deserved to be loved, but rather who was willing to show love. From that day on, many who heard the story had to confront a choice. Some, like the priest and the Levite, continued to pass by the needy, keeping their purity and safety intact. But others began to see the world differently. They realized that in every wounded and abandoned person, there was an opportunity to demonstrate God's love in a practical and real way. And so, the lesson of the Good Samaritan continued to echo through generations. At every corner of life, on every difficult and treacherous road, there would always be opportunities to act with compassion, to show that true love makes no distinctions but reaches out to all who are in need. I'm so glad you're enjoying the story. Let's continue along the same lines, expanding the text to ensure the narrative remains rich, engaging, and with the depth necessary for your 40-minute video. I'll continue to develop the reflections, character implications, and lasting lessons from this parable. Days passed, and the injured man, now resting in the inn, began to regain his strength. His body, once fragile and on the verge of death, was starting to show signs of recovery. However, more than his physical state, it was his soul that was undergoing a profound transformation. Lying in his bed, he found himself constantly thinking about the Samaritan who had extended a helping hand. The image of that stranger, who had set aside his own concerns to save him, was etched into his memory. And with that, he began to question everything he had been taught until then. How could he continue to harbor the hatred and disdain that had been instilled in him toward Samaritans, when one of them had been his only hope for survival? This was a question he could no longer avoid. He had been saved not by someone of his own faith, not by a priest nor a Levite, but by someone who, according to his culture, should have been his enemy. This realization haunted him, but at the same time, it opened his eyes to something greater. As his body healed, his mind raced. The image of the Samaritan was a constant reminder that the barriers between peoples were not from God, but from man. Each act of compassion broke down yet another prejudice, and he found himself wondering, how could he despise the one who saved him from death? Throughout his life, he had been taught that his people were special, that there was a clear division between those who were pure and those who were not. But now, in the quiet of that inn, he realized that love and compassion were not limited to a nation or a belief. They transcended the borders that men had erected. And at that moment, something inside him began to change. He wondered how he could live the same way after this experience. Could he return to his normal life, ignoring the fact that love for one's neighbor wasn't confined to those of his own faith or culture? Could he, from now on, pass by a Samaritan without remembering the one who had saved him? The answer, he knew, was no. As these reflections passed through the man's mind, the Samaritan continued on his journey. But, true to his word, he had not forgotten his promise. After finishing his commitments, he returned to the inn to check on the man he had rescued. Upon arrival, the Samaritan was greeted by the innkeeper, who quickly updated him on the wounded man's recovery. The news brought a calm smile to the Samaritan's face, and he immediately wished to see him. When he entered the simple room where the man was resting, the two locked eyes for a moment. The Jew, still recovering, looked deeply into the eyes of his savior. "You came back," the man said, his voice still weak but full of gratitude. "I said I would," the Samaritan replied humbly, sitting down beside the bed. "How are you?" "Much better, thanks to you," the man responded, unable to hide his emotion. There was a mix of admiration and wonder in his voice. For a few moments, the two sat in silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that exists when words seem insufficient to express the depth of what is felt. "I don't know how to thank you," the man began, still overwhelmed by what had happened. "You don't need to thank me," the Samaritan said softly. "I did what anyone should do." That simple phrase echoed deeply in the wounded man's heart. What anyone should do. But the truth was many hadn't done it. The priest and the Levite, who had passed him before the Samaritan, had done nothing. They had moved on, ignoring his suffering. "But why did you help me?" the man asked, finally voicing the question that had haunted him since the Samaritan had found him. "You knew I was a Jew, and you're a Samaritan." The Samaritan looked at him for a moment, then responded calmly, "I saw a man in need. It doesn't matter where you're from or who you are. What matters is that you needed help. And in that moment, I could help." The simplicity and sincerity of the Samaritan's words hit the man like a revelation. There were no ulterior motives, no hidden agendas. The Samaritan had helped because he believed it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return or felt obligated. He acted out of pure compassion. After a brief conversation, the Samaritan stood up, knowing it was time to continue his journey. He had fulfilled his mission there, and the wounded man was now on the path to recovery. Before leaving, he looked at the man one last time, who was still visibly emotional. "Take care of yourself," the Samaritan said, "and remember to do the same for others when you get the chance." With those words, he left the inn, leaving the man with a lesson he would never forget. The injured man sat in silence, processing what he had just heard. Do the same for others. It was a simple but powerful idea. He knew the kindness he had received shouldn't stop with him. There was now a responsibility, a new way of seeing the world and those around him. The man stayed at the inn for a few more days, regaining his physical strength, but feeling as though his soul had already been healed. He was ready to return to his life, but he knew he would never be the same. As the years passed, the story of the Good Samaritan continued to be told and retold in different places. It wasn't just a story of a single act of kindness. It became a symbol of what it truly means to be human. The Samaritan's example challenged, and still challenges, social and religious conventions, showing that love for one's neighbor knows no limits. For many who heard this story, the lesson was clear. True faith, true goodness, isn't found in words or appearances, but in acts of compassion, in the ability to see another's need and respond to it without hesitation. The Samaritan, unknowingly, planted a seed in that wounded man, a seed of compassion and responsibility, which would grow into acts of kindness and mercy toward others. From that moment on, the man saw the world through new eyes. He no longer saw people by their differences but by their needs. He learned, through the deepest experience, that one's neighbor is not defined by geographic proximity, ethnicity, or religion, but by the simple fact of being human. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho, with its rough and treacherous terrain, wasn't just the backdrop for this story. It was a metaphor for life, filled with dangers, choices, and opportunities to show mercy. At some point, all of us walk this road. Sometimes we are the fallen man, in need of help. Sometimes we are the ones who pass by, out of fear or indifference. But at some point, we are called to be like the Samaritan, to reach out, to show that true love doesn't care who the other person is, only what they need. When Jesus told this parable, he wasn't just answering the question of who is my neighbor, but offering a radical vision of what it means to live a life of love for others. The neighbor isn't just the one who looks like us or shares our faith. The neighbor is anyone who needs us, and true compassion is to act when we see that need. With this lesson, the parable of the Good Samaritan transcended the centuries, remaining an eternal message of love, compassion, and the deep connection that exists between all human beings. Each of us, as we walk the roads of our own lives, is called to live this truth and to transform the world around us through small but powerful acts of kindness. If this story touched you and made you reflect on the true meaning of loving your neighbor, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can share more powerful messages that inspire, transform, and spread compassion. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll be the first to receive these heartwarming lessons. See you next time.